Today I'm flipping the script and I'm sharing 6 items that I've stopped packing for my adventures on the bike. This one was completely my fault. Hi guys, my name's Sappy Sprocket and welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be talking about shedding unnecessary weight and streamlining my packing process. Now there are several items that I genuinely stopped packing over the last 12 months, and there are very good reasons. Now if you want to check them out, stick around because we're about to take a jump into the stuff that I threw in the bin. In the meantime, don't forget to hit subscribe and let's go! Now I feel like this one is going to be so controversial with you guys, but the number one item that I stopped taking on trips is headlamps, head torches, and flashlights. After countless motorcycle tours, I made a surprising decision. I no longer packed a torch with me. Initially, I relied on it for those dark, remote nights, and truth be told, when I originally did take torches, I would always pack 2, just in case, because I was a little bit afraid of the dark. However, I gradually turned to my phone's flashlight instead, and it was more convenient, it was always at hand, and it was surprisingly bright. Eventually, I questioned the need for a separate torch altogether. After a few trips without a torch, I realized something even more important. I didn't miss it, and actually it was better not to carry it. I found it easier to see in the dark without artificial light. Sometimes it's easier to forget that we are just wild animals, and our eyes do actually adapt to the darkness. You can see in the moonlight, and truth be told, you don't always venture too far from your tent at night, even for the toilet, to really need a torch. The next item that I dropped from my bags was excessive clothing. Now, in the early days of motorcycle touring, I was a fiend for packing clothes. My packing list grew with every trip, especially regarding clothing. Socks in particular were a huge weakness, and I'd always pack more pairs than I could ever physically wear. More often not when I got home, there were still clean socks in my bag. There were trips where I was even throwing socks away en route to make space for food. Now, of course, this all changed after my North Coast 500 trip, where I forgot to actually put my clothing bag inside my luggage, and I ended up wearing the same outfit for 6 days straight. I smelled really bad. But what I did realize was that although I did smell horrific, I only got a couple of growth spots on my back, and ultimately it didn't kill me. So from this point onwards, I've only ever packed 2 sets of base layers, 2 sets of underwear, and 3 pairs of socks. And I'll usually wear the same outfit for about 2 to 3 days, depending on how gross I get. Usually at the end of the week, I then just go find a campsite and I'll wash all 3 sets of clothing in one go. I'll scrub them down with soap and water. Sometimes I just wear the clothes in the shower and scrub it. Sometimes if the campsite had a washing machine, I'd use that, and sometimes I'd just use a lake. It didn't really matter. And then I just leave them to dry outside my tent overnight. And to be honest, 3 sets were still really generous. You could probably get away with just 2 sets of clothing if you were traveling even lighter and you weren't traveling in wet, windy conditions, like in the middle of summer. It would be very easy just to take 2 pairs of clothing. But for me, I wanted that backup to have dry clothes just in case at nighttime. Now, the next item that I dropped from my bags was the towel. Now, the towel was a staple in my motorcycle touring gear for the longest of times. Yet no matter how often I packed it, I'd often reach the shower block only to discover I'd left it behind in my tent, and then I'd often be too lazy to turn around and go and get it. But it also highlighted a deeper issue. The towel seemed to be more hassle than it was actually worth. Not only did it take up a lot of precious space in my luggage, but it was also a challenge to keep dry on the move every single day, and I would rarely actually remember to take it to the shower block. Frustrated by its constant inconvenience, I ditched the traditional towel altogether. Instead, I discovered a surprisingly effective alternative, which is the dry, clean sock. Compact, quick drying, and always at hand, a spare sock became my go-to for post-ride showers. Not only did it save a ton of space in my backpack, but it also served as a reminder, the beauty of simplicity whilst on the road. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that we least expect, and it just made more sense. And I never really forgot them for whatever reason, so yeah, towel out, socks in. Now, the next thing that I gave up carrying on the road was pots and pans. Now, while initially I thought I needed them for the ultimate camping culinary experience, the reality was far from picturesque. Cooking, cleaning, washing up after a meal just became more of a hassle than it was worth. The stress of dealing with all the bulky cookware on the road, it was just it was enough to put like a dampener on my adventure. Now, during my trip to the Isle of Skye, I decided to try like over fire cooking because I kept like getting so many comments on my channel all the time, like how I should try like real cooking on the road and none of that like packet muck. And so the end result was I went to the shop and I bought some food and I tried to like cook it like on like a frying pan like everyone was suggesting, and I nearly caused a gas explosion in the middle of the campsite. But more importantly, cleaning the like burnt food off that pan was so awful. I was so grumpy. And also you have to remember to carry like dish soap, like sponges, tea towels, all of that to prevent rust, and then you have to stand at the sink scrubbing them like you're not on holiday, and you just end up with all this like excess junk that you just don't need to carry. And it was so rubbish. So I made the bold decision to just get rid of the pots and pans entirely, and I embraced a more simpler and more practical meal solution that required minimal cleanup, and ultimately I switched to foil wrapped meals that only required hot water to cook them. And by doing that, I found like a whole newfound freedom in just letting go of like all the unnecessary stuff that you do in your day-to-day life. Now, many of you have commented about military rations not being the tastiest, but for me, they actually have like this like nostalgic 90s like primary school meal vibe to them that makes me feel like quite happy, and ultimately none of the kitchen stress. So out with the cookware, in with the packet food. The next thing that I scrapped, again, probably very controversial, but that was the sleeping bag liner. I binned my sleeping bag liner, and the days of wrestling with the liner are long behind me on motorcycle tours. Despite its intended purpose of adding both warmth and a sense of hygiene to my sleeping setup, it just always ended up in a tangled mess at my feet by morning. I'd like set it up really nicely, and then just more or less it would just be there in a ball at the bottom of my sleeping bag. And frustrated by the constant unruliness that it brought in my life, I decided to just leave it behind. And instead I found a simpler solution, just wearing a fresh set of base layers to bed. Not only are they more warm, but they also eliminate the need for a liner, and when it got really cold I just pull out 2 foil blankets and put one at the base of the floor and also one in the roof of my tent, and it worked a lot better than a liner as well. Now, when it got really super cold, I'd sleep in my heated gear as well, plugged into like a dodgy battery, and it was again more effective than a sleeping bag liner. I personally think that sleeping in base layers is more hygienic than it is to use a sleeping bag liner that you don't really wash. Am I supposed to wash it with my clothing all the time? But I wasn't washing it on the road, I'm gonna be honest. So my clothes were getting more washed, so it made more sense for me to just use my base layers than it did for me to use the sleeping bag. Am I just really gross? Am I just like really gross? I'm not like this at home, I swear. I don't know, the camping brings out the worst in me. Next, you may or may not have noticed if you've been following my content over the last year, I ditched the sleeping mat with the built-in pump. A lot of you were like super obsessed with this, and you were like, that's so cool, like having to like, you can pump your like sleeping mat up with your feet. And honestly, trading in my sleeping mat for a simpler mouth-inflated alternative was much better in terms of my touring setup. Opting for a simpler mat meant that I said goodbye to the perpetual struggle of keeping mud off my sleeping mat. Because obviously when you come to set up base, you have to like stand on the mat to pump it up. And by streamlining the setup, it meant that I just wasn't sleeping in filth. And mostly what made me change as well is just like when you end up like standing in dog muck, and trying to like use the pump without shoes on was really difficult. Now, at first, the allure of a mat with an integrated pump seemed like the pinnacle of convenience, but its bulk quickly became a big burden. It hogged precious space in my backpack, and it left less room for the essentials. With a more streamlined sleeping setup, I definitely feel like I can rest easy knowing that I have a lot more space in my bag to fit chocolate bars. Now, I'm considering switching my sleeping mat up again actually, because one of the issues that I've been facing over the last year is punctures. I haven't decided if I'm going to go for like a roll-up or a folding or even like a cot yet. So any suggestions would actually be really super helpful. And I'll be honest, I am leaning towards like testing out a camping cot, because when I do tend to go on those longer camping trips, the idea of a more comfortable place to sleep at night sounds really appealing. So I just don't know how I'll attach it to the bike yet. So it's definitely one that I'm currently researching. The next item that I ditched on the road that I'm going to talk about is a cup and utensils. Now, I stopped taking utensils on the road, and I also ditched carrying a mug around for hot drinks, thanks to a simple and yet more effective alternative, which is my trusty mesh tin. Now, initially I thought that a cup was essential for enjoying hot drinks on the road, but I soon discovered that the mesh tin was far more practical. Now, because the tin has a larger surface area, it meant that when I was making drinks, they were cooling down a lot faster. This offered so many benefits, especially like when I had slept in and I was in a rush to get on the road. I'd also be able to cool my drink down much faster to get it to that drinking temperature. By the time I'd finished breakfast, when I was using a cup, my brew would still be too hot to drink. And I always found that when I was using a cup, I'd have to pour away some of the coffee and top it up with cold water to drink it when I wanted to drink it. Now, in addition to ditching the cup on the road, I obviously got rid of the knife, the fork, the spoon. I used to carry metal, kind of like the utensils, the standard camping ones, and they were just honestly a massive pain because they would get too hot or too cold, and they were just a bit of a pain for keeping clean. Maybe I was buying cheap ones, I don't know, but they constantly tasted metallic and they started to be really prone to rust. I ended up swapping them out for a plastic military spork, which has been so great. It's so good. It's really easy to keep clean. I will eat with it and then I'll rinse it off with boiling water, and nothing, food doesn't stick to it at all. I'll wipe it down and then I'll just kind of clean it with a little bit of soap, rinse it again, or sometimes I'll just use some anti-bac and spray it on, and then rinse it one more time. I don't even dry it, I just throw it in the bag at this point because it's plastic, it's not going to rust. It's just one less thing to have to keep track of on the road, one less thing to have to wash, one less thing to just add to your daily things to do. Yeah, I don't think I'll ever go back to using a knife and fork on the road. And there you have it, folks. That is the items that I stopped taking on my motorcycle touring in the last 12 months. From shedding unnecessary weight to embracing a more simpler life on the road, these changes have ultimately revolutionized the way that I conduct my adventures in ways that I never imagined. Ultimately, I'm a little bit smellier and a little bit more gross, but a lot less stressed on the road, which is what it's all about. Now, in the comments below, do let me know if there's something that you recently stopped carrying on your adventures, especially if it's something that people wouldn't normally expect. I really want to hear that. For everyone else, I hope that you found this video helpful for your journeys ahead. And do try to remember, it's not about how much you pack or even how little you take. It's ultimately about finding solutions that work for you personally. And ultimately, whatever keeps you on the road and keeps you undertaking those adventures is the right amount of stuff that you need to be carrying. So in the meantime, thanks for tuning in. My name's Safi Sprocket. Until next week, ride safe, stay crazy, and I'll see you then. This one was completely my fault.